Like the little ticking that goes on there. Makes you think, what is that? What is that? Of course, I wake up in the morning and hopefully hear some ticking going on, but maybe you do too. Well, we're in this series, 167, and that talks about the hours that we're not here in worship. That's that other 167 hours. And last week we started this new series, 167. And we're going to spend the next couple of months slowly walking through the book of James together. And it's kind of like those books for dummies. This is kind of like a letter that James provides for Christ followers, some solid wisdom on how we can practically live out our faith in those 167 hours a week that we aren't in church together, or in person or online. And we said last week that nobody's better to give practical wisdom about living out their faith than besides James. I mean, he was the brother of Jesus. He saw Jesus, before the crowds and behind the scenes, which means that James probably picked up some wisdom along the way. James began his letter by talking about trials. And we discovered together that God doesn't waste my trials. And today we move from focusing on trials to focusing on temptation. And here's how James begins this next section of the teaching, James 1:12 through 14. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Now, there's a lot to unpack in these verses, so let's start with the basics. James means what he means here when he says temptation. Specifically, in this context, we're talking about the temptation that leads to sin. In other words, ways that we miss God's mark for our lives. Temptation is that enticing feeling we get when we engage in something that is ultimately sinful. And the original Greek interpretation for the words temptation or to tempt, James writes and translates to make proof or to test. And both of these words have an internal element to them, meaning we're moving from trials and troubles that are around us to a testing and temptation that is within us. Well, let me say one thing that, clearly that I hope will free some of you. Feeling tempted to sin is not a sin. But feeling the temptation or desire itself, that's not sinful. And we're going to dive into that further as we unpack what James says about God not tempting us. And also talking about a time when Jesus was tempted. However, this is an important distinction to share with you now. Temptation itself is not a sin. We all feel temptation. It's what we do with it. So back to the idea of temptation. For some of us, this word temptation might come with a few stereotypes or labels attached to it. We might only think of temptation in specific ways, which limits the idea of temptation and how it affects each of our lives. The reality is we're all tempted by something. No matter how old or how young we are, I mean, you may be young like me, but temptation impacts all of us. And one of the best examples of this comes from the Stanford Marshmallow experiment, or the Marshmallow test, which was first done in the 70s. And it's this experiment: a child is brought into a room with a marshmallow on the table and presented with two options. They can either eat the marshmallow that's in front of them, and that's all they get. Or they can wait a specific time period without eating the marshmallow, and they'll get a bigger reward. Then the adult would leave the room, and the experiment would begin, and the child would wait. It's a snapshot of a roller coaster of emotions. The child goes through with the marshmallow in front of them. As you can imagine, the longer the child had to wait, the lower the success rate was. However, if the child was able to wait for the designated amount of time without eating the marshmallow, according to the research, they found that they had a higher likelihood of life, of a better life, and the outcomes in future. Temptation affects all of us. And let's be honest, we're tempted by more than just marshmallows. For some of us, it's pleasures of life that become the greatest temptations, the instant gratification through any means necessary might be our driving force, and it causes us to engage in certain practices and unhealthy ways, or whether that be alcohol, food, drugs, sex, the list can go on and on. It tempts us with the promise of pleasure. And for some of us, it's accumulating possessions. That becomes our greatest temptation. To put it bluntly, we love money and the stuff money can buy. And we're willing to do whatever it takes, including bending our moral and breaking our budget, to have the latest and greatest stuff. Our checking account, retirement funds, and net worth become what drives us in life. And for some of us, it's the allure of power and success that becomes the greatest temptation. We look at different relationships and maybe even our own careers and power structures that we are destined to climb up. Success becomes our drug of choice. We're tempted to do whatever it takes to make sure we finish on the top when we do everything. For me, it's that temptation of power that will often reel its ugly head. I'm still dealing with the voices from my childhood that said, you'll never amount to anything, that caused me to become a workaholic early in my adult life, and I had to work harder and be better to quiet that voice. I was still fighting perfectionism, but these days I can hear the voice of my Savior who says, I'm good enough. You were good enough for me to die for you. And he says that about each one of you too. So what does temptation look like for you? Is it one of pleasures, possessions, power that stands out above all the others? Or can you identify with ways where you feel tempted in all three? I know sometimes I do. And you have permission to be honest with yourself about what tempts you without bullying yourself. What better moment than now to take a honest look inward on how it is with your soul when it comes to temptation? Was there any sin that you felt enticed by throughout this past year? And how is that going for you? So don't push everything under the rug now. You're going to get back to at work and you're going to communicate. You communicate this longer in the steps that you need to take. You know, during this past time, it's been a rough thing. I mean, most of us some of us didn't have to go to work during the shutdown. And so the steps we had to take to get to work were from, the bed to the couch. It was about it. But you ask God how He can reveal to you what needs to be restored, not only in your new life, but in your soul. What's the next step you need to take? Temptation has this terrible knack of making us feel stuck. Whether it's the fear that we're always going to feel this way, or guilt that we're feeling tempted in the first place, or the shame of giving in to temptation, we probably feel stuck where we're at. Temptation tries to sell us that great lie about ourselves to trick or deceive us. But I've got good news for you today. Friends, God is in the business of truth and helping people get unstuck. And He can make what seems impossible actually possible. And James reminds us of where God is and what He is doing in the midst of temptation. Let's look back at the verses here again. James 1:13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. James makes one thing abundantly clear here. God is not the one who tempts us. He's not standing over there and playing some kind of a human chess game, moving the pieces around and trying to cause chaos. He does not tempt because temptation is not from him. In fact, in the Gospels, which are the accounts of Jesus' life, a time is talked about when Jesus himself was tempted. And the one tempting Jesus was not God, but the devil. Temptation does not come from God. So if God isn't tempting us, then where is he? Is he willing to help us, deliver us from temptation? God's not our tempter. He is our deliverer. Think with me about the prayer that Jesus taught those closest followers to pray, the Lord's Prayer. You might remember a line from it that goes like this: "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." Jesus shows us here that God is our deliverer, not our tempter. And I like to picture it this way. Temptation is like the classic school-aged bully. And I know this might sound weird, but stay with me. Those of us who were bullied might relate. My temptation bully does whatever it takes to force me to give in to their demands, whatever that might be. So in the moment, I feel pretty overwhelmed and powerless against the bully. But then I'm reminded that God, my Father, is waiting there for my call. He's there to protect me when I call him. And James continues on by focusing on the ultimate goal of temptation, to entice and deceive you. And here's how he closes the section, James 1:14 through 16. "But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. The word entice comes from the Greek word deleiso. In Greek, it means literally to bait a catch. So you think about it like fishing. Now, I'm not much of a fisherman. I mean, I like to fish, but I never seem to have the time. My dad used to love fishing. He used to say, "If you see me, you see my fishing pole," because he carried it with him all the time. But to have a successful day on the water, you need to have some good bait or lure to attract the fish. And once you've got your bait and your lure, you cast that line in the water and just wait for the right unsuspecting fish to take the bait. Then the fish will bite, and it's your job to reel it in. And James says here that temptation, when we endure it, is the same effect for us as good bait does for fish. It tricks us to go right in. Then James takes it a step further. He goes on to say that when we're tempted and give in, then giving birth and creating sin in our lives, that will linger. And commentaries suggest that James purposely used this visual of giving birth as a way to illustrate a long-term effects of giving in to our temptation. This is something bigger than just one time. This leads to more. He says that what ways, or what was once we thought we could give up, giving birth to sin, and the sin is growing, and that will result in death. I think this is why James follows up with a clear warning: do not be deceived. We know what that's like, don't we? We've all been in that moment and succumbing to temptation, and we realize we've been tricked again, and it's not fun being deceived. And then comes the whole host of other feelings of guilt and shame and embarrassment. Temptation is a great scam that aims to fool our heart and our mind. But God offers us another way. We don't have to be victims of this great scam. We can be victors in God's power and provision over temptation. His promise of deliverance stands true. He pours out wisdom and grace for us to see another way. We not be able to completely control what goes on around us, but we can control where our thought of temptation goes. It either becomes something more or we turn it over to God. And I'm reminded, I heard one time Rick Warren say something about temptation. You don't want to go around the places where you're going to be tempted. He said, if you're afraid of getting stung, you don't go near the beehive. When we turn it over to God, He can deliver and redeem our temptation. He not only sees us through to the other side of temptation, but He can use it for something good. When we're able to resist temptation with God's help, we can discover a more mature and grown-up faith. Here's how we can summarize what we can learn from James' teaching today. God can use temptations that entice to grow faith that endures. Trusting God in the midst of temptations that are meant to entice us can create an endurance in our faith that's irreplaceable. Our faith grows up when we encounter temptation. Notice that James doesn't give us the secret formula here to never be tempted again in our lives. But what he does focus on is how God can deliver us in the midst of temptation, and how our faith can build endurance through resisting temptation. Temptation will present in our world and in our life, but we have a choice in what we will let temptation become. Something that leaves us stuck or something that helps us get to the next step in our faith. The influential priest and theologian of Reformation, Martin Luther, described it this way. Temptation, of course, cannot be avoided. But because we cannot prevent the birds from flying over our heads, there is no need that we should let them nest in our hair. You have a choice of what temptation becomes in your life. Will you let it entice you into a great scam, or will you turn your temptation over to God and let Him bless you and grow your faith? Look back with me at how James begins the section here. He said, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial." And that word blessed is the same word that Jesus used in the Beatitudes. And it means God extending His favor. And here's what James is saying. God extends His favor for those who endure under temptation. And we can choose a blessing and endurance instead of that's something that we can thank God for. And this might all sound great. In fact, we have a choice with our temptation is great. But let's get practical for a moment. It's not an easy resisting temptation in the moment. Sometimes the bait seems too good for us, and the hook is set before we even think about it. So how can we better resist temptation and choose blessing and endurance in our everyday life? To help us with this, we can look at Jesus' temptation and the three things He did in response to resist. And we see in Matthew's account of Jesus' life that He was led into the wilderness and fasted for 40 days when the tempter came to Him. And 3 different times Jesus is tempted, and 3 different times He resists. Jesus models for us here practical ways that we can choose endurance over being enticed. Number 1, we trust in God's purpose. The tempter came to Him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones become bread." And Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." In the first attempt, the tempter tries to get Jesus to question God's provision. He's trying to get Jesus to put his own needs above God's purpose. And then Jesus reminds the tempter that God will provide for him. And the life was more than just bread. Jesus was looking to God's purpose on his life above his current need for food. And another way to say this is that Jesus was secure in his identity of God. He knew God as Father, and he was literally God's child. Keeping in mind, just before he went into the wilderness, Jesus was baptized, and God declared, "This is my Son, whom I love and with whom I am well pleased." his purpose was assured because his identity was secure. And I think it's always interesting to note here, this was before Jesus called any disciples. This was before he preached any messages. This is before he healed his first person. He hadn't performed any miracles. He hadn't done anything. And God said, "This is my Son, with whom I'm pleased." And he says that over each and every one of us. We don't have to earn his love. We don't have to earn his approval. It's there. You know, we can do the same. We can remember that God's purpose is greater than our temptation because we're made in his image. We are his creation. And through faith, we are his children. And the tempter was not done, though, when he tried again. Jesus had a different response for the next model here, number 2, rest in God's plan. "If you're the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command the angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." The tempter tries to get Jesus to question God's plan to protect him. He tempts Jesus to throw himself down and to see if God will lift him back up. But Jesus' response is not to test God's plan, but to rather rest in God's plan. It might not be what we imagined, or it might not look like what we want, but we can rest in God's plan for our life. Remember that this is the same God that can redeem our trials and temptations. We can choose to rest in God's plan in the midst of the fear that comes with our temptation. And I think a lot of temptation we face is based upon the fear of something greater. Something unfulfilled or unsettling in us leads to us to go looking in other places. And fear does not have the final word because we can choose to rest in God's character and his plan for us. Instead of one of the ways that I'm best reminded of God's plan in my life is when I'm surround myself with the people that are consistently remind me of that. And whether that's my weekly accountability or my Thursday night men's small group or my other close relationships and friendships. The more I'm around people reminding me to rest in God's plan instead of my own fear, the better off I am. Do you have a person or those people in your life? Maybe the next step is finding that one person or that group that can remind you to rest in God's plan. I did this. I knew I needed it, and so I sought it out. I called 3 or 4 guys and said, "Hey, I want to meet. I think we need to get together." And there's nothing stopping you from doing that either. There's one more response to temptation that Jesus had. Number 3, rely on God's person. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." So lastly, the tempter tries to shift Jesus' focus off of God and onto other things. He tries to get Jesus to worship him in exchange for the kingdoms of the world. But Jesus responds by focusing on the person of God. He tells the tempter to worship God and to serve him only. No focus on earthly kingdoms or what the world can afford, but relying upon who God is. And guys, in case you don't know it, everything we have here is going to go away. It'll go away. The only thing that's going to last forever is our relationship with God. That's something we need to work on. My temptation and fears seem small when I begin to understand how big God really is. And I know for me, I have an easier time relying on God when I get to know the person of God. When I discover more of who God is, then I learn how trustworthy He is, how faithful, how loving, how forgiving, how redeeming, and the list just goes on and on. My temptation of power, my insecurity, the voice of my inner critic, it all fades in the background. When I listen to my Heavenly Father's voice, when I get to know His voice, He reminds me that what I need is Him. Not a compliment or an accolade or an opportunity. I just need Him. What about you? I mean, the choice is yours. Will you trust God's redeeming power to turn your temptation that was meant to entice you into a faith that endures? I'm going to invite the band to come back up. We're going to do one more song. But I want you to think about this. Maybe you're like me. Maybe that voice in your head tells you you need this. And whether that's there's the three tricks that the devil uses. The power to have goods, to have more. The power to look good, whether you build yourself up and you're on the top. And like I said, for me, it's that power to not necessarily look good, but I have to be the best. I had voices in my childhood that said, you'll never amount to anything. You're never going to be good enough. And I have to look at those voices and say, I want to listen to this voice. Because this voice tells me that I'm a child of God and a person of worth. And that's the voice we need to listen to, folks. We forget about the other ones. They don't mean a thing. This one is eternal. These are all going to go away. All right. Let's, as this next song plays, I invite you to spend a time in prayer. Our altar is open, or you can pray where you are. Those of you at home, you can pray where you are. And maybe spend some time saying, God, this is the temptation I have in my life. I need you to help me with this temptation. I need to endure this so I can grow my faith. Let's stand and worship.